Hi there, Emily Midget here today with you for Ellen Hutson, sharing the first of my new coloring series videos called Exploring with Emily. During this series, I will be focusing on a different medium each month and showing you my best tips and tricks on how to get good results for your projects. For my very first installment in the series, I'm working with the Pinkfresh Liquid Watercolors. I'm going to show you some basic watercoloring with these liquid watercolors, as well as a fun watercoloring technique that is super simple and creates a very unique effect. Let's get started with the details. These watercolors are pigment-based, and the saturation and depth that you can achieve with just a very tiny amount of the liquid is amazing. The bottles each come with a dropper so that you can accurately determine how many drops of color you're taking out, which comes in handy if you are trying to recreate a previously made color combination. The dropper also features a child-proof lid, which is handy if you have little ones helping in your craft room like I do. As you can see, the color manipulates very easily from super concentrated to very subtle with just a quick swipe of your wet paintbrush. I'm using the tonic glass matte for my palette, but you could easily use some plastic packaging or even a sheet of laminated paper. You don't need a great deal of pigment. I usually start with a drop or two on my palette, then depending on the technique, might add some water or another drop of pigment if I'm creating a custom color. And because the color is so pigmented that you only need a drop or two, these little bottles will last for a very long time. For the first part of my project, I began by doing some basic watercoloring on the new Bookworm Lady from the October Leading Lady release. I first die cut and stamped the leading lady, a stack of books, and her teacup using Hero Art's intense black waterproof ink onto some Arches cold press watercolor paper. I find that Arches watercolor paper works quite well with most watercolor mediums, and for the techniques I will show you today, it works quite nicely due to the fact that it will hold a great deal of water without disintegrating. To watercolor my die-cut pieces, I simply add small amounts of pigment from the Pinkfresh Lavender watercolor, then use the tip of my clean, wet paintbrush to pull the color out and maneuver it all over the die cut. As you can see, the color responds very well to the wet paintbrush, moving quite easily and allowing you to manipulate it. Because there is quite a bit of water added to the initial dabs of pigment, it does dry a bit lighter in color than it looks when wet, but it is quite easy to add a second or even third layer of color to help intensify that color. This technique is essentially the same for all of the die-cut pieces, so I will just show you a small portion of the actual watercoloring in this manner. For the background, I wanted to show a fun technique that is super easy with these liquid watercolors because they're already liquid. Wet on wet watercolor. I began with a large panel of Arches cold press watercolor paper and stamped a background pattern using Mondo Peonies and Ink on 3 fade out ink so that I could do some no-line watercoloring. I taped the stamped panel down to a bamboo cutting board to help alleviate warping since the entire panel will get very wet. For the wet on wet technique, the goal is to create a very mottled, ethereal look that to me is one of the most unique and beautiful aspects of watercoloring. Watercoloring can be very precise, but it can also be very free-form and loose. The project that I show you today is a combination of the two styles. For the wet on wet technique, begin with completely clear water. If you use dirty water that has pigment in it, your image can become discolored from those previous colors. Saturate your paintbrush with as much water as it can hold, then get the entire image wet and drop your color in. This technique can be done with pretty much any watercolor medium, but it's particularly fun and easy with liquid watercolors. For my floral panel, I began by saturating my flowers with clean water, not bothering to pay attention to the individual petals. I added 2 drops of bubblegum and 1 drop of lavender liquid watercolors to my palette, then added 5 drops of clean water using a dropper. This diluted fuchsia will become the base wash for my peonies. I mix the color, then drop it randomly on the very wet peony image. You can see the pigment blooms on the wet watercolor paper, creating that unique mottled effect that can be achieved only through watercolor. I swirled the color around with my wet paintbrush, getting in all of the nooks and crannies around the edge and keeping the edges crisp. I also added a few drops of very diluted lavender to create even more color variation for my base layer. I repeated the process for all of the stamped peony images on the panel. After I had finished with the first layer of my peonies, I used my heat gun to ensure that the colored images were completely dry before beginning to add the detailed layers. I find that when the images are warm to the touch, they are completely dry, which means that we can move on to the next step. I dropped a few drops of bubblegum ink onto the palette without adding any water, then began adding shadows and detail to the mottled flower images. The details of the stamped images are still visible through the light first layer due to the translucence of the watercolors and the additional water used to dilute the pigment. Using these subtle lines as a guide, I begin adding the undiluted pink color at the bottom of each petal, following the natural curve of the petal and using the tip of my clean damp paintbrush to pull the color out into a nice fade. You'll notice that I'm repeatedly turning the cutting board depending on which petal I am painting. This allows gravity to help me pull the color out organically, as well as allowing me to keep the point of my paintbrush as sharp as possible by keeping the brush pointed away from my body. I am sure to leave some of the spots on the petals untouched by more pigment, creating contrast between light and dark areas, which helps to emphasize the shadows and create a more dimensional effect. The combination of the mottled, multicolored first layer and allowing some areas to remain as light as possible helps to add to the realistic effect that we are trying to achieve. After completing the first layer of detail on these flowers, you could probably stop. These flowers have quite a bit of shading and depth already, but you can take it even a step further by adding a few more shadows with some lavender. Purples are a great color for adding shadows, and so I added 1 drop of lavender to 2 drops of bubblegum and began adding a third layer of pigment to help further emphasize those petals that might be just a bit further behind the others, thus creating more shadows. Be sure to keep the edges of the petal next to the one you're working on nice and crisp so as to maintain the contrast. The trick to no-line coloring is to never paint 2 areas that are right next to each other. For example, in this piece, I am sure to work on petals that are not next to each other while still wet. This prevents your painted areas from bleeding into each other, which takes away the crispness and definition of each petal. After finishing painting all of the details on the flowers, as well as adding some emerald to the foliage, I began work on the background, again employing the wet-on-wet technique. I used my heat gun to ensure that my images were completely dry to prevent bleeding, then began using the same process to add color around the flowers. I saturated the paper with clean water, then randomly dropped in undiluted sapphire and lavender ink and swirled the colors around with my wet paintbrush until I had achieved the look I was after. I left some of the natural blooms from the wet watercolor while also maneuvering the color around to create that loose, flowing effect. For this looser wet-on-wet technique, I used a larger paintbrush which can hold more water. The amount of water already on the paper in addition to the very wet paintbrush will create a much more subtle color after the paint has dried. So I decided to go back and add some more pigment to enhance and deepen the pretty blues and purples. While adding more color, I also used the very tip of the paintbrush to clean up the edges of the flowers and make them nice and crisp. After the entire panel had dried, I placed it under some heavy paper pads for a couple of hours to help reduce any warping. Even when using great watercolor paper like the Arches Cold Press and taping it down to the cutting board, the sheer volume of water that I used on this piece created some warping, so letting it rest under some heavy papers helped flatten it out. I wanted to create a bookmark and a card front, so I cut pieces of the panel using the tag from the Neat and Tangled Build-A-Tag dies and a rectangular infinity die from the Hero Arts for the card front. I heat embossed 2 of the greetings included in the Bookworm Lady stamp set onto some charcoal cardstock and then trimmed them down to small rectangles. For the bookmark, I wanted to keep things fairly flat, so I added the "A Book a Day Keeps Reality Away" sentiment strip with some liquid adhesive and added a hot pink satin ribbon. For the card, the die-cut floral rectangle was slightly smaller than A2, so I mounted it on a panel of A2 charcoal cardstock, then adhered the die cuts and sentiment strip using dimensional foam adhesive. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our first exploration into different artist mediums with this video on Pinkfresh Liquid Watercolors. I am so excited to share my thoughts and tricks with you throughout this Exploring with Emily series, and I hope you found some of the information that I shared today informative and helpful in your own exploration of the Pinkfresh watercolors. For more information and product links, check the YouTube description below or head over to the Ellen Hutson blog. Thank you so much for watching, and have a marvelous day.